Hello again. Welcome to another Google Hangouts for ANP2. My name is Colin Cairns. I am a health science tutor here at the Learning Center of Baker College of Auburn Hills. And today I'll be reviewing a PowerPoint from Chapter 20 on the urinary system. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up for you. My disk isn't being recognized. Let me see.
What disk?
This.
Oh, okay. I get it.
I went to screen share. There was no full screen there. Why was that?
There should be.
There wasn't.
Okay, well, one of these we need to let go using.
That was unplugged earlier.
It's gonna have to be again. There you go.
Yeah, but was the screen share wasn't showing up. It didn't say.
All right, let me see. Is it on right now? Yeah, it's screen sharing.
Is it?
Yeah, this is a screen share, constant screen share.
Okay, so it could be. Let's do that.
You're also very live at the moment, so they're seeing this right now. So there you go.
I think there's
Let me get my headache medication. I have a migraine. I don't want a migraine. So I'm gonna get rid of my migraine. All right.
Okay, sorry about the delay there. A little problem with my jump drive. So Chapter 20 in the introduction talks about homeostasis, maintaining the composition, pH, and volume of body fluids within normal limits is one of the functions of homeostasis. The urinary system removes metabolic wastes and substances, including foreign substances like drugs and their metabolites that might be toxic to the body. The urinary system consists of a pair of kidneys, a pair of ureters, a urinary bladder, and a urethra. And this slide shows the different parts of the urinary system. Kidneys themselves are reddish-brown, bean-shaped organs with a smooth surface, about 12 centimeters long in adults, 6 centimeters wide and 3 centimeters thick. They're enclosed in a tough, fibrous capsule. And here's another slide showing the location of the kidneys. And here's a picture of kidney structure. As you can see, there's the renal capsule surrounding the kidney, the cortex, the medulla, the minor calyx and the major calyx, the sinus, the renal pelvis, the renal papilla, the renal pyramid, and a cutaway showing the nephrons, the collecting ducts, and here's a renal corpuscle and a tubule. This shows the blood supply to the kidney. Blood flows from the inferior vena cava. And also there's a suprarenal artery that feeds the kidney. That is connected to the abdominal aorta. And here's a cross section with the branches of that suprarenal artery. The main function of the kidneys is to regulate the volume, composition, pH of body fluids. And as we said before, the kidneys remove metabolic waste from the blood and excrete them to the outside of the body. The kidneys also help control the rate of blood cell production, regulate blood pressure, and regulate calcium ion absorption. 21 has a clinical application about chronic kidney failure. And in it, the patient has to undergo hemodialysis 3 times a week, and that's to maintain good concentrations of waste, electrolytes, and water. And the patient also had to control their intake of water, sodium, potassium, and proteins between treatments. Again, here's another slide of renal blood vessels, where the cortical radiate artery and vein feed the kidneys, and the arcuate vein and artery, and the interlobar vein and artery. And let's look at an animation of fluid exchange across the walls of the capillaries.
At the arterial end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is 13 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is minus 7 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. Approximately 9/10 of the fluid that leaves the capillary at its arterial end re-enters the capillary at the venous end. About 1/10 of the fluid passes into the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system.
Okay, here's a shot of the proximal convoluted tubule along with the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole, and the blood flow that goes through the nephron loop. As you can see, the descending limb and the ascending limb, arterial blood flow, and then the venous blood flow. And here's a juxtaglomerular apparatus showing the capsule, glomerulus, the afferent arteriole. And here's the cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons, the cortical nephron, juxtamedullary nephron, the collecting duct. And the blood supply of a nephron. So blood flows from the renal artery to the interlobar artery, to the arcuate artery, the cortical radiate artery, to the afferent arteriole, through the glomerular capillaries where the gas exchange takes place, to the efferent arteriole, to the peritubulary capillaries, to the cortical radiate vein, the arcuate vein, and interlobar vein, and finally to the renal vein. and into the inferior vena cava. 20.2 has a clinical application on glomerulonephritis, which is results usually from an abnormal immune reaction that develops 1 to 3 weeks following bacterial infection by strep. The infection is not in the kidneys, but the antigen trigger production of antibodies that form insoluble immune complexes that travel in the bloodstream and lodge in the kidneys. So they block the glomerular capillaries, which become further obstructed as the inflammatory response sends white blood cells to the region. Any capillaries that remain open might become abnormally permeable, allowing plasma proteins of red blood cells to enter the urine. In severe cases, this will cause renal collapse, and if there's no treatment, this disease is usually fatal within a week or so. This is a progressive disease in which more and more nephrons are damaged until the kidneys are unable to function. The condition is not fully understood, but it may also involve formation of antigen-antibody complexes that precipitate and accumulate in the glomeruli. And then the prolonged inflammation fiber tissue replaces the glomerular membranes, permanently disabling the nephrons. And eventually the kidneys will fail. Let's talk about urine formation. The main function of the nephrons and collecting ducts is to control the composition of body fluids and remove waste from the blood. The product is urine. Urine contains waste, excess water, and electrolytes. Urine is the final product of the processes of glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. So, as the slide before, the animation showed that there's a net filtration out of the arterioles into the interstitial fluid, and then there's a net reabsorption into the venule and path of the blood flow. And then you have the filtered fluid entering the renal tubule, and then there's tubular reabsorption into the capillaries, and then the capillaries engage in tubular secretion, and then eventually that produces urine. And here's showing substances that move from the blood to the glomerular capsule. Here's a look at plasma, the filtrate, and the urine components. As you can see, sodium is the same concentration in plasma and the filtrate. 128 milliequivalents in the urine. Whereas potassium, there's a lot of potassium in urine, and much more magnesium in the urine. But bicarbonate, there's less bicarbonate, a lot more sulfate, and a lot more phosphate. Very little sugar is left in urine, but a lot of urea and a lot of uric acid and creatinine. The main force that moves substances by filtration to the glomerular capillary wall is hydrostatic pressure of the blood inside. So the blood inside presses on the arterial walls, and that causes the capillary walls, I'm sorry, and that causes a net outflow of fluid. So you take the outward force and subtract the inward force of the plasma osmotic pressure and the capsular hydrostatic pressure, and you get a net filtration pressure of 10 millimeters. The filtrate rate is directly proportional to the net filtration pressure. So It's force favoring filtration, the glomerular or capillary hydrostatic pressure, minus the forces opposing filtration, or the capsular hydrostatic pressure, and the glomerular capillary osmotic pressure. So normally the net filtration pressure is positive, causing filtration. So the forces responsible include hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure of the plasma, and hydrostatic pressure of the fluid in the glomerular capsule. The GFR remains relatively constant through a process called autoregulation. Certain conditions, though, will override autoregulation, including when the GFR increases. But primary three mechanisms are responsible for keeping the GFR constant. Those include autoregulation, increased sympathetic impulses that decrease GFR by causing afferent arterioles to constrict, the hormone-like renin-angiotensin system, and there's also the hormone natriuretic peptide, ANP, which affects the sodium, causing an increase in the GFR. So we have the liver releasing angiotensinogen, the kidney releasing renin that converts to angiotensin 1. Then there's an angiotensin converting enzyme that is released and also causes stimulation to produce angiotensin 2. And then you have an increased aldosterone secretion, increased ADH or antidiuretic hormone secretion, and increased thirst. Let's talk about tubule reabsorption. And that's where substances move from the tubules into the interstitial fluid, where they then diffuse into the peritubular capillaries. The proximal tubule reabsorbs 70% glucose, water, urea, proteins, and creatine, amino, lactic, citric, and uric acids, phosphate, sulfate, calcium, potassium, and sodium ions. And here they're showing blood flow into the afferent arteriole, fluid in the filtrate, and then tubular reabsorption in the peritubular capillaries. And also we have blood flow where you have the peritubular capillaries secreting into the tubule. And here's a slide that shows some of the things that are happening. Sodium ions are reabsorbed into the capillaries by active transport. Negatively charged ions are attracted to the positively charged ions, so you have chloride coming in. And then as the concentration of ions increase in the plasma, the osmotic pressure increases, and water moves from the proximal tubule to the capillary by osmosis. And then you should have an isotonic concentration here. These are the average values for sodium and water filtration, reabsorption, and excretion. The average amount filtered per day of water is 180 liters. The amount reabsorbed is 99%, and only 1% of water is excreted. Sodium, 630 grams, 99.5% is reabsorbed, and only 0.5% is excreted. 20.3 has a clinical application on the nephrotic syndrome. What happens is you have a loss of plasma proteins, proteinuria, which results in widespread edema and increased susceptibility to infection. The plasma proteins enter the urine because of increased permeability of the glomerular membranes, which accompanies renal disorders such as glomerulonephritis. As a consequence of the decreasing plasma protein concentration, the plasma colloid osmotic pressure falls, increasing net filtration pressure in capillaries throughout the body. So this may lead to widespread accumulation of fluid in interstitial spaces in the tissues, which is edema. And then you could have that happening in the body spaces such as the abdominal cavity, that's called ascites, pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, and joint cavity. So when this edema happens, the blood volume decreases and blood pressure drops. So what is activated is the renin-angiotensin system, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, and the posterior pituitary will then release antidiuretic hormone, which in then turn stimulates the kidneys to conserve sodium ions and water. And then this action helps restore blood volume, but it also might aggravate the edema. This nephrotic syndrome sometimes appears in young children who have lipoid nephrosis. The cause is unknown, but it alters the epithelial cells of the glomeruli so that the glomerular membranes enlarge and distort, allowing proteins to be filtered. Tubular secretion. That's when substances move from the plasma of the peritubular capillaries into the fluid of the renal tubules. Active transport mechanisms function here. This will be secretions of substances such as drugs and ions. And here's a good picture of that. You have tubular reabsorption of sodium into the peritubular capillary. You have tubular secretion of potassium and hydrogen into the tubule. So in the ascending limb, there's lots of sodium in the tubular fluid. And in the descending limb and the collecting duct, you'll have lots of sodium, potassium, and some hydrogen. So let's talk about the regulation of urine collection and volume. Hormones such as aldosterone and the atrial ANP affect the solute concentration of urine, particularly the sodium. The ability of the kidneys to maintain the internal environment is due in large part to their ability to concentrate urine by reabsorbing large volumes of water. And then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct are impermeable to the water, so the water may be excreted as dilute urine. If the antidiuretic hormone is present, these segments become permeable and water is reabsorbed by osmosis into the extremely hypertonic medullary interstitial fluid. As counter current mechanism in the nephron loops, the descending and ascending limbs ensures that the medullary interstitial fluid becomes hypertonic. This mechanism is known as the counter current multiplier. The vasa recta also contributes as a counter current mechanism. Blood flows solely down the descending portion of the vasa recta, and sodium chloride enters it by diffusion. Then as the blood moves back up toward the renal cortex, most of the sodium chloride diffuses from the blood and re-enters the medullary interstitial fluid. So consequently, the bloodstream carries little sodium chloride from the renal medulla, preserving the pressure gradient. The countercurrent multiplier creates a large osmotic gradient for water reabsorption in interstitial fluids surrounding the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts in the nephron. The epithelial lining of these structures is impermeable to water unless the antidiuretic hormone is present. The higher the blood levels of ADH, the more permeable the epithelial lining becomes, increasing water reabsorption and concentrating the urine. Soluble waste and other substances are excreted in minimal water, preserving body water when dehydration is a threat. If the body fluids contain excess water, the ADH secretion will decrease, and the epithelial linings of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct become less permeable to water, less water is reabsorbed and the urine becomes more dilute. I think the next table will summarize the role of ADH in urine production. So if you have low ADH levels, you have very dilute urine. And if you have high ADH levels, you're going to have highly concentrated urine. And the concentration of water in the blood decreases. There's an increase in the osmotic pressure of the body fluids, which stimulates osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. That hypothalamus will signal the posterior pituitary gland to release the ADH. Blood carries your ADH to the kidneys. The ADH causes the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts to increase reabsorption by osmosis, and the urine becomes more concentrated. And here's a shot of isotonic fluid flowing down the descending limb. It's permeable to water, so water leaves. We have an increase in the sodium chloride concentration. We now have hypertonic fluid in there, and then the sodium and the chloride leave, and you have a hypotonic fluid at the end. So if you have water and coming out, you have even more salty. And here's another shot to sodium chloride coming in, and vasorecta influences the sodium chloride to leave into the interstitial fluid. So here's a chart of the function of the nephron components. Glomerulus filtration water and dissolved substance from the plasma. The capsule receives a filtrate. The renal tubule reabsorbs glucose, amino acids, creatine, lactic acids, and the ions. Reabsorbs proteins by endocytosis. Reabsorbs water by osmosis. Reabsorbs chloride ions and other negatively charged ions by electrochemical attraction. And then there's active secretion of substances such as penicillin, histamine, creatinine, and hydrogen ions. The descending loop, there's reabsorption of water by osmosis. The ascending loop, there's reabsorption of sodium, potassium, and chloride. The distal convoluted tubule, there's reabsorption of sodium ions, reabsorption of water, but there's active secretion of hydrogen ions and secretion of potassium ions, both actively and by electrical chemical attraction. And then when we talk about the collecting duct, there's reabsorption of water by osmosis. Let's talk about urea and uric acid excretion. Urea is a byproduct of amino acid catabolism. The plasma concentration reflects the amount or protein in the diet. It enters the renal tubules through glomerular filtration. It contributes to the reabsorption of water from the collecting duct. About 80% of it is recycled. Uric acid is a product of the nucleic acid metabolism. It enters the renal tubules through glomerular filtration. Most reabsorption occurs by active transport, and only about 10% is secreted and excreted. Urine composition usually reflects the volumes of water and solutes that the kidneys must eliminate from the body or retain. So it's either elimination or retention in the internal environment to maintain homeostasis. It's going to vary from time to time due to dietary intake and physical activity, but normally it's about 95% water. It has urea, uric acid, creatinine, trace amounts of amino acid, varying amount of electrolytes. And again, volume varies with fluid intake and environmental factors. Diuretics increase urine secretion. Renal clearance. This is the rate at which a chemical is removed from the plasma. It indicates the efficiency of the kidneys. And there's a couple of renal clearance tests, actually 3 of them listed here. Inulin clearance test. The test, it's inulin is a polysaccharide. A known amount of inulin is infused into the blood at a constant rate. The inulin passes freely through the glomerular membrane, so its concentration in the filtrate equals that in the plasma. In the renal tubule, it's not reabsorbed to any degree, nor is it secreted. So consequently, the rate at which inulin appears in the urine can be used to calculate the rate of glomerular filtration. With the creatinine clearance test, that's produced at a constant rate during muscle metabolism. And like inulin, it's filtered but neither reabsorbed nor secreted by the kidneys. So you compare the patient's blood and urine creatinine concentrations to calculate the GFR. So one of the advantages of this test is the bloodstream normally has a constant level of creatinine. So just a single measurement of the plasma creatinine levels provide a rough index of kidney function. If there's elevated plasma creatinine levels, that will suggest that the GFR is greatly reduced. And because nearly all of the creatinine in the kidneys that the kidneys filter normally appears in urine, change in the rate of excretion might reflect renal failure. And the last one is the PAH test, or para-aminohippuric acid test. Any PAH that remains in the peritubular capillary plasma after filtration is secreted into the proximal convoluted tubules. So all pH that passes through the kidneys appears in the urine, and the rate of pH clearance can be used to calculate the rate of plasma flow to the kidneys. Then if the hematocrit is known, the rate of the total blood flow through the kidneys can be calculated. And here's an animation on renal clearance. Concentration of substance in the plasma. And concentration of substance in the urine. So you take the substance in the urine times the rate of urine formation in milliliters per minute and divide it by the concentration in the plasma. And it's the plasma clearance of the substance per minute. And here's inulin clearance. It's really filtered. And some of its water is reabsorbed, but the inulin is not reabsorbed or secreted. And the RPC is going to equal the GFR. Okay. Elimination of the urine. After forming along the nephrons, urine passes the collecting ducts to the openings of the renal papillae, enters the minor and major calces, passes through the renal pelvis, enters in the ureters, enters in the bladder, and the urethra carries that urine out of the body. Each ureter is about 25 centimeters long. They extend downward posterior to the parietal peritoneum. They run parallel to the vertebral column. They join the urinary bladder and the pelvic cavity. The wall of the ureter has 3 layers: inner mucosa, a middle muscular layer, and an outer fibrous coat. And here's a slide showing the inner mucosa with the lumen, and then the muscular coat and the fibrous coat, and it's surrounded by adipose tissue, what also known as fat. The urinary bladder is hollow, distensible, which means it can inflate. It's a muscular organ located within the pelvic cavity, posterior to the symphysis pubis and inferior to the parietal peritoneum. It contacts the interior walls of the uterus and vagina in the female and lies posterior against the rectum in the male. The opening for the ureters is the area of trigon. It has 4 layers. We have an inner mucous coat, a submucous coat, a muscular coat, and outer serous coat. Smooth muscle fibers comprise of detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of the bladder wall. If a ureter becomes obstructed, such as by a small kidney stone, or what's known as renal calculus in the lumen, strong peristaltic waves begin in the proximal part of the tube, which may help move the stone into bladder. The presence of the stone usually also stimulates a sympathetic reflex, which is called a ureter-renal reflex, that constricts the renal arterioles and reduces urine production in the affected kidney. And here's a shot of ureters. And you can see you've got 2 of them. And here's a shot of the bladder. And cross section of the layers of the bladder wall, muscular mucus and submucus, and lumen. And this is fat here surrounding it. And you have the female bladder and the male bladder. The urethra is a tube that conveys the urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. Its wall is lined with a mucous membrane. It has a thick layer of longitudinal smooth muscle fibers. In a female, it's only 4 centimeters long. It runs obliquely. In a male, it's 17.5 centimeters long and has a dual function for both urination and reproduction. And this, in a male, it has 3 sections: the prostatic urethra, membranous urethra, and penile urethra. And here's a shot of a slide of urethra with the glands, the muscular layer, the lumen, and the mucous membrane. Micturition, or urination. Urine will leave the bladder by the urination reflex. The bladder distends as it fills with urine. Stretch receptors are stimulated, and they signal the micturition center in the sacral spinal cord. Parasympathetic nerve impulses travel to the detrusor muscle, which responds by contracting rhythmically, and then the need to urinate will be urgent. Voluntary contraction of the external urethral sphincter and inhibition of the micturition reflex by impulses from the brainstem and the cerebral cortex can prevent urination. But following the decision to urinate, the external urethral sphincter is relaxed, and the impulses from the pons and hypothalamus facilitate the micturition reflex. The detrusor muscle contracts, and you're expelled through the urethra. Neurons in micturition reflex center fatigue. The detrusor muscle relaxes, and the bladder begins to fill with urine again. And here's the micturition reflex in animation.
The micturition reflex involves impulses traveling from the urinary bladder to the sacral region of the spinal cord, and from the sacral region of the spinal cord back to the bladder. It is coordinated by neurons in the spinal cord and can be influenced by signals from the brain. When the urinary bladder becomes stretched, there is an increase in the frequency of action potentials carried from the bladder wall to the sacral region of the spinal cord. In response, parasympathetic neurons from the spinal cord to the bladder are activated, and this causes the smooth muscle on the bladder wall to contract. The sensory signals to the sacral region of the spinal cord also stimulate ascending pathways to the pons and cerebrum, which results in the conscious desire to urinate. If urination is not convenient at the time, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord to inhibit the micturition reflex. Impulses carried via somatic motor neurons keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which also prevents urination. When urination is desired, signals from the brain stimulate the micturition reflex. The brain also decreases action potentials in the somatic motor neurons to relax the external urinary sphincter.
Okay, here's some of the developmental abnormalities of the urinary system. There's cross-fused ectopia, fused kidneys that lie on one side of the midline, horseshoe kidney, nephrotic syndrome, protein in urine due to abnormal glomeruli, oligomeganephronia, which is reduced number of nephrons that are normally large, polycystic kidney disease, cysts form in the renal tubules and or the collecting ducts, and renal agenesis, renal dysplasia, renal hypoplasia. Those are all either absence of kidney or abnormal kidney structure, or there may be a small kidney with fewer nephrons. And then tubular dysgenesis, which is abnormal function of proximal tubules, and then a vasochoroidal reflex. Urine backs up from the bladder to either the ureter or the kidney. And let's look at basic renal processes. And let's show infiltration. And reabsorption. And finally secretion. Uh, 20.4 has a clinical application of urinalysis and clues to health. There's a few different conditions. Wilson disease, which is an inherited inability to excrete copper. If people are properly diagnosed and given the drug penicillamine, urine becomes color of copper. Some genetic conditions don't cause health problems, but they do alter the color of the urine. People with bacteria excrete dark pink urine after 8 beats. People who sometimes will eat asparagus, and they have a urinary excretion of odoriferous component of asparagus. And then there's a blue diaper syndrome due to a defect in the transport of the amino acid tryptophan in the small intestine. Bacteria degrade the unabsorbed tryptophan, producing a compound that turns blue on contact with the outside, or oxygen. So when a baby urinates in the diaper, the urine turns blue. Okay, let's talk about lifespan changes. The urinary system is sufficiently redundant or has backup structures in both structure and function to mask most age-related changes. But the kidneys become slower to remove nitrogenous waste and toxins and to compensate for changes that maintain homeostasis. And changes can include kidneys appearing scarred and grainy, kidney cells can die. By age 80, the kidneys have lost a third of their mass. Kidney strength is just usually due to loss of glomeruli. Proteinuria may develop. The renal tubules thicken. It's harder for the kidneys to clear certain substances. The bladder, ureters, and urethra lose elasticity, and the bladder will hold less urine. Okay, so let's talk about some of the outcomes that you need to assess for this chapter. You should be able to name the organs of the urinary system and list their general functions. Describe the location, structure, and function of the kidneys. Trace the pathway of blood flow through the major vessels within a kidney. Describe a nephron and explain the functions of its major parts. And then urine formation. Explain how the glomerular filtrate is produced and describe its composition. Explain how various factors affect the rate of glomerular filtration and identify ways that this rate is regulated. Define what's known as tubular reabsorption and explain its role in urine formation. Identify the changes in the osmotic concentration of glomerular filtrate as it passes through the renal tubule. Identify the characteristics of the countercurrent mechanism and explain its role in concentrating the urine. Define tubular secretion and explain its role in urine formation. And then there's elimination of the urine. Describe the structures and function of the ureters, urinary bladders, and urethra. Define micturition and explain how it occurs and how it is controlled. And describe how components of the urinary system change with age. Okay, our next AMP2 Google Hangout will be on chapter 21 and 22, which is about water, electrolyte, and acid-base balances. And then we have, that's 21, and then 22 is on reproductive systems. So I am going to have to take a look at the slides to make sure I can fit both chapters into one presentation. Otherwise, I will have to break it up. But I will see you next week. I'll have an invitation for this posted by the end of this week. And I'll make sure that if I do break it up, I will make sure to let you know ahead of time. And thanks for listening.